I'm Georgia and this is The Sound of Georgia. Today we're going to be talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. So Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella is going to be coming down to Sydney in November. So this is a very premature video that will connect with it, sort of. But with that said, I am talking about the original version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. When they took it to the stage, which I think was only in 2013, I want to say. But when they first made it into a stage musical, they added a lot more, and obviously Rodgers and Hammerstein were both long dead, so they've got other people writing a whole bunch of new songs in there. But today we're not focusing on any of that. We're focusing on just the original, the pre-musical version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. And also, when I say the original Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella, I mean the original. Not talking about the one from 1997 with Brandy. I'm not talking about the one from 1965 with Leslie Ann Warren. I'm talking about the original 1957 live production with Julie Andrews. Ah yes, now I get it, you're saying. Now, to be fair, the original one from 1957 is the only one I have seen. I haven't seen the one from 1997 with Brandy or the 1965 one. And I haven't bought tickets to the show yet. I just keep buying more and more tickets to Hamilton. I'm definitely going to see it in November or December, and I am very, very excited to see how it's changed. So, the original one from 1957 is the only one I have seen, but I also think it's the best one to talk about when discussing what we're going to be talking about in this video. So this version, as I said, is from 1957. It was broadcast live, and it had the biggest audience of people tuning into a television show at that time. And it was written specifically for Julie. This is what I want to talk about specifically with Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. It is very realistic. And very intentionally realistic. Julie mentions in her memoir how they were going for a very realistic touch to this most famous of all fairy tales. And I think that really worked to its advantage. Cinderella as a character gets a bad rap just in general. She's weak, she's passive, she only wants the prince. Yeah, no. Find me a version of Cinderella where she wants to marry the prince is greater than her want to go to the ball. I'll wait. But with this specific version, Cinderella is very modern, and I almost feel like maybe feels a bit more progressive than she actually is. It's hard to explain. In Rodgers and Hammerstein's leading ladies are certainly not damsels in distress. But doing this most famous fairy tale of all fairy tales, this version of Cinderella is much more proactive than most versions from 60 plus years ago are. And I think that really is all down to the realistic elements of the story. And that's why I wanted to talk about this one specifically. As I said, I haven't seen any of the other versions of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, but I imagine the further on you go into history, the less ahead of the times Cinderella would be, because, well, she's catching up. Like, for example, there is a scene after the ball, after Cinderella's pulled her on her and left the slipper, and the prince is being all moody. And he set guards out across the entire kingdom to find her. And he tells his mother he loves her and he'll never be happy without her, yada yada yada, fairy tale shtick. But the queen doesn't tell him it's going to be alright, you'll find her. She actually says the exact opposite.
But there's one fact I want you to face. You may never see her again. I don't want you to waste your life on a dream.
You don't know anything about her, you might not see her again, and you need to be prepared for that fact. Now obviously a lot of this is the fact that it's Rodgers and Hammerstein for starters, and that they wanted to do the realistic approach, but that sort of dialogue in a Cinderella movie would be pretty unlikely, and back 60 plus years ago would be practically unheard of, I'd say. Now obviously Rodgers and Hammerstein are very different from Disney, who is far more fairy tale-esque. Rodgers and Hammerstein were quite different. A lot of the stuff between the prince and his parents are actually very realistic and relevant and deep. A lot of the interactions between the prince and the king and the queen are very different and very deep and relevant and realistic and not what you'd expect in a fairy tale. His mother's worried that he's not really happy. He tells his father that he is happy, but we can tell he's not really. and he's not particularly interested in the ball. And the king and queen are very much his parents just as much as they are the king and the queen. They're also hilarious. They remind me a lot of the king and queen in Ever After, or even the king and queen in Shrek 2. Maybe it's just the actors in this particular version who were actually married in real life. But I just love them. They're hilarious. When the princess guys come to Cinderella's house and in their search for trying the slipper on everyone, the fairy godmother just kind of pops up out of nowhere and asks, well, have they tried the slipper on Cinderella yet? And yeah, we'll get back to the fairy godmother and how she just kind of pops up. Obviously, as per the story of Cinderella, she has not tried on the slipper, but when they go and look for her, she's not there. That's when we cut back to the scene that I talked about earlier with the prince and the queen in the garden. And who's hiding in the background? Yep, Cinderella. She doesn't run over to him, but when they catch her, she tells them she was there to see the prince.
What are you doing in the palace gardens?
I came to see... It doesn't matter, I'll go.
She didn't just run out of the house to hide or to get away. She went off to find the prince. This is Cinderella in 1957. A Cinderella in 1957 went off to find the prince. If that happened in a Cinderella movie today, it would be, well, kind of what Disney's doing right now with all their live action remakes. Their live action leading ladies is a discussion for another day though. But Cinderella running off to find the prince after she's heard the news about the glass slipper would not be as big a deal and as big a departure from the original character in a movie today as it would have been back then. Heck, even 2015 Cinderella didn't rush off to find the prince the day after the ball. But here's the thing though. Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella is not a modern Cinderella, in the sense that it's not set in the late 1950s. It's not a retelling in the way that a Cinderella story is, and Cinderella story is a retelling because it's set in the modern era. Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella is not like that. We are very clearly in the past, in the fairy tale world. There is magic and there's a king and a queen and a full-on ball, so it is definitely not a retelling. But I feel like a retelling of Cinderella that was made and set in the late 1950s would be exactly like this. Suffice it to say, Cinderella in a fairy tale would not act the same way Cinderella in a retelling did, regardless of when the retelling came out. Cinderella is in a different world. Regardless of what you think of, like, the 1950s Cinderella, she exists in a fairy tale world, and if a retelling of Cinderella had come out that year, she would act very different. The difference between Cinderella in Cinderella and Cinderella in a Cinderella-esque story, just because the two stories would be fundamentally different in a lot of ways. I feel like a retelling of Cinderella that was made in the 1950s and set in the modern time, and by that I mean the 1950s, would look exactly like this. The only difference would be that there's no magic, because honestly, the stepmother and the stepsisters are very tame, all things considered. They're not really nice to Cinderella, but they're not absolutely horrible to her either. There's no real, you are not going to the ball moment. And when the guards ask to try the slipper on her, there's no, don't you dare try the slipper on her. It's more of a, well, there's no point on trying the slipper on her, she was never there. Honestly, I don't even know whether the stepmother knows that it was Cinderella at the ball. We never see Cinderella with the second class slipper, and while she does have her dreamy song that makes them kind of wonder a bit, there's no moment where the stepmother goes, she's hiding something. She's also not set on marrying one of the stepsisters off to the prince at any cost. In fact, she actually says to them, whether or not you marry the prince, you both have to marry someone this year. So let's talk about the fairy godmother. Cinderella knows the fairy godmother going in. She doesn't just show up on the doorstep and Cinderella's going, wait, who are you? What's happening? Cinderella knows about her. Why? Don't know. How? No idea. So when the fairy godmother arrives and comes in and they start talking about the ball, Cinderella says she wishes that her godmother were a fairy godmother and that she could then help her go to the ball. To which the godmother says,
Only thing is, it's dangerous to believe too much in good fairies and guardian angels. Why?
Well, you get to lean on them too much. You get in the habit of sitting back and expecting them to do all the work for you.
Again, Cinderella. And every time she mentions the ball, the fairy godmother shuts her down by saying, "It's impossible. It's not going to happen." And then they sing Impossible, and it's only at the very end of the song that the fairy godmother finally changes her rags into a ball gown and the carriage and the mice and all that. It's only at the very, very end of the song that her wishes are granted, because the fairy godmother had to make sure she really wanted it. It's magic and the fairy godmother's the one that does it, but Cinderella still had to earn it. Fairy godmother had to make sure she really, really wanted it. This original version's like less than 90 minutes long, so there's not a lot to unpack here. But in a nutshell, this thing is so ahead of its time. And I think that is not just because of Rodgers and Hammerstein, but because of the approach they took with it. I think if they hadn't gone for such a realistic approach, it would be very, very different. And that's everything I've got for today, guys. The entire thing is on YouTube. I will leave it linked down below if you want to watch it. But let me know if you have seen it. Let me know if you've seen any of the versions, whether it be this one or the one with Leslie and Lauren or Brandy or on the stage. And what's your favourite song? My favourite is definitely In My Own Little Corner, though I still maintain Impossible is the I Want song. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my video next week. So long for all.